Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Tech Tactics Live, episode 90. Tonight, we're going to be talking about this little thing here. This is known as the IMS bearing. If you've been inquired about anything from 1997 to 2008, you've probably come across IMS and the bearing topic. But before we get into it, we want to make sure we thank Pirelli, our sponsor for Tech Tactics Live. Without their support, none of this would happen. Of course, I want to remind you to, if you like the show, if you like our videos, be sure to give us a like. More importantly, subscribe if you don't want to miss out on further PCA and Porsche content. We're just about to 90,000 subscribers, and then we'll just be 10,000 subscribers away from that 100K mark. And also, if you're watching us live tonight, I'm going to be monitoring the live chat area because we're going to have a portion of this where you can ask our experts that are here with us tonight any of your questions. And speaking of our guests, let's introduce them. We have Jake Raby with Flat 6 Innovations, Charles Navarro from Ellen Engineering. I'm wearing my overalls here. It's kind of a mess. I'm kind of a mess because this is day 3 of me actually approaching a project that mere mortals are probably scared about. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we start, let's go on the agenda so you know what we're going to be talking about tonight. Robert, the agenda, please. The history of the M96, M97 IMS bearing. How is the IMS Solution, what I've chosen to install on my car here, different from other IMS bearings? Can they do it yourself or do this project themselves? What will you need to do this project? So if you allow me, let me just share with you how we got here. So my car here, this is a 1999 911 996 with about 98,000 miles. About in 2009 or so, my car is an early car, has a double row bearing. This here is the original double row bearing. Damon, I don't know if you want to come in and zoom in on that. And so as a preventative, what I chose a LN bearing, also still a double row, but with, I believe, ceramic bearings, and you guys can talk all the details on that. But this is also something that has a mileage limit and a time limit. So with 98,000 miles, I started to think about the next bearing that I was going to put into the car. And so before we talk about what I chose, talk about a little bit the M96, M97 engine and what that bearing does. I know we have a whole series that on YouTube we record in 2017. How has the landscape changed, or has it remained the same when it comes to the IMS bearing?
Well, not a lot's changed in that amount of time because we had done so much research and had so much application time up until that point. Things are just kind of leveled off, and we've learned which engines have the most amount of problems. Most engines have already had a retrofit done at this point. Some people still don't really think that it's a problem, so some cars have not had it done. Of course, some people also don't know the problem exists still. Mm-hmm. So the landscape really hasn't changed much. It probably changed the most in the period from about 2009 to about 14. That's when a lot of things happened in this world that kind of changed the landscape. Products came on the market. We had more tools. IMS Solution came out, and that really kind of shook things up.
Can you share with us, maybe Charles, if you will address 3 types of bearings through the course of 97 to 2008? We have
Yeah, so basically with the 97 through 99, those were all dual row bearings.
Like this?
Like that.
Yep.
And then in 2000, 2001, it was a switchover year. So some cars have a dual row, some cars have a single row. And then in '02 through '05, most of the '05s, they all have single row bearings. And then in '06 model year, they changed to a larger non-serviceable bearing. So basically you have to disassemble the engine to be able to change the bearing out. And some '05s, you'll get in there and you'll find the bigger bearing. It just matters when the engine was produced that went into that car.
And so one of the things, if you're not sure about your car, I remember from our video before, is don't assume whatever engine you have because of the model year that your car has that particular bearing, because early cars, I think you said, some cars where engines were replaced and the bearing might not match what you think the year of the car is.
Exactly, especially if you have a 2000 model year, it's a change up. You could have a dual row or a single row according to that. Also, I've even seen some 2001 models that should have had a single row that had a dual row. And of course, if you had an engine replacement after 2006, even for this 99 model year car, then you would have that larger non-serviceable bearing because it would have been in that engine as a upgrade, basically. So even if the engine was going to go into an earlier car, it still got the newest technology at the time.
I remember having owned this since 2005, and the topic of IMS was quite large on all the internet forums, and because not a whole lot of information was out there, numbers were tossed around, some people were really alarmed about it. And like all cars, not just Porsches, every make, every model has some sort of Achilles heel. But what I feel like today, if you're getting into M96, M97 motored car, there's so much information out there that you can make a solid decision of what your course of action to do with the IMS bearing.
Of course, yet research is obviously the key. Talking to people that have had problems, have not had problems. I always tell people, go to your local PCA region. Go to that region, talk to the tech advisor, talk to people who have actually experienced good and bad experiences with this, and just make your decision on what you want to do. The main thing is just awareness, right? And one of the biggest things is, if you go look at some of the other models of cars out there, they have problems that are too deep to fix. So when we came up with the tools and the processes and invented all this stuff, this is actually a serviceable thing now. When we first started this, the question wasn't, should I change my IMS bearing? It's how can you change an IMS bearing? So all that stuff on forums greatly changed over the years because we used to just be doubted as being able to pull it out because everybody said it can't really be pulled out. There's really no good way to do it. There's no factory tools to do it. There's no factory procedure to do it. So we had to do it on our own. So it is a problem, but at the same time, it's something that can easily be addressed. And like in your car, if you hadn't had all these cam deviation issues and needed an AOS and all this, we could have left this engine in the car using my procedure and just pulled the gearbox out.
Well, let's talk about sort of my next step in the IMS bearing. So this is my factory dual row one. This is the LN with the ceramic bearing. At the time of my decision to put in a new bearing, this was, for me, the only option at the time. I mean, maybe there were other brands, but I chose this one. But the one that you helped me or guided me through the installation that we have now is called I think it's trademarked, IMS Solution. And it takes, this here has, I believe, 19 components or so, and it pulls it down to one component.
Really, pretty much two.
Two components, right.
If you want to look at it, inside this dual row bearing, we counted up last night, using the IMS Solution that's just got a plain bearing and it's one single moving part there, it's rotating around a part stud, which actually counts as a part. But we got 19 parts in this bearing. We had 11 parts in the single row version of the bearing. So we're literally in your engine replacing 19 individual pieces with one.
And the bearing, the journal bearing, the plain bearing, if you're not familiar with that term, it's actually a bearing that has been used in Porsches before.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, since we had the lay shaft, basically the intermediate shaft, going all the way back to the 4-cam Carrera in the 547 days, it had an intermediate shaft. It was supported radially and longitudinally by the crankcase, and also had a feed of oil going to it, so it rode on that pressurized film of oil. So all the Metzger 6-cylinders did it. You know, honestly, when I had the original idea, the first night I took one of these engines apart, I told Charles, this ball bearing doesn't belong here. This should have been a plain bearing, and I want to make that happen. And that's kind of how I invented it.
And you have a patent for it.
Actually, it's covered by 3 patents.
3 patents, okay.
Yes.
Well, let's do this because there's a lot of questions propping up here, and I want to organize that. While I'm doing that, Charles, if you would explain, because you know how we got here, and you two can have the conversation of, you know, cam timing deviation and why I decided to drop the engine versus doing it in the car.
Okay.
So you guys carry on with that conversation while I look over here.
Yeah,
Charles.
so basically that we look at the engine as a holistic, look at the whole picture. And we knew we were going to do the IMS bearing, and Vu had already done the water pump, but the best, what I recommend, and a lot of other people recommend, is when you go to do this job, don't go in with blinders. You have to look at the whole engine, and we did this so we could pull it out and do the AOS. The water pump was already done. We can do all the AOS tubes, the oil fill tube, do the IMS bearing. We can do the rear main seal. It's much easier to do all this work if you're doing that much work with the engine out of the car. And these things were designed to drop out. There's quick disconnects on everything. So it's really easy to get the engine out if you have a lift and a lift table
Yes.
to do this work.
And it's a systematic approach. You know, if Vu did not have these other items that needed to be addressed, it would have been an easy choice to make. Let's just leave the gearbox in the car, and let's do it the way we originally developed our procedure, where the gearbox is pulled out, you remove the flywheel and clutch pressure plate arrangement, and then you have direct access under here to the IMS area. And it's one of those things where when you've done this, and now Vu can say this, it's a little intimidating in the beginning because you just don't understand the architecture, the geometry, and what the real process is. And like I told Vu before we started, you know, when I take on a big project, doesn't matter if it's an engine I'm building or I'm wiring a car or whatever, I just try to do one thing at a time. So when you're doing this, the process is long and a lot of pieces to it. But if you just say, look, I'm going to pull the gearbox, and you do that. Then you go to the next thing. Okay, I'm going to pull the flywheel and clutch. Do that. Then you get down to the intermediate shaft area, and then you start following our instructions about that. You know, a lot of guys have been able to have successful endeavors doing this at home, using quick jacks and things like that. More guys have lifts at home. So it's definitely become a more DIY thing, which is ironic considering back in the day, the doubt was, could it even be done?
Be done, yeah. So I will share with you all, you know, normally I don't know if you can show all my tools here, Damon. So normally I do all my work at home because all my tools is nicely organized. I know you're shaking a little bit having to come into a garage that isn't nicely organized, but I brought all my tools, almost all my tools into the office here to do it here so that we can film. We're actually doing a multi-part series upcoming talking about fix what isn't broken yet. And all of that is basically talking about maintenance, dropping, if you're going to drop the motor, what are some of the more popular, more critical items that you can do while it's out. And, you know, if I had to I guess, educate someone on considering doing this on their own, whether or not to keep it in the car, and, you know, many kudos to those that can do all this stuff in their car and they're proficient at it. But as a DIYer, taking the motor out of a 996 is definitely doable. Just the whole concept can get you, you know, excited or nervous or whatever. But as Jake said, if you follow it step by step, and I'll give a shout out to Pelican Parts. Pelican Parts has a great write-up on their page. We actually printed it out and just used it as a checklist as well, because it was Damon and I and Manny that we took the motor out ourselves. Charles and Jake weren't even here yet. And we just went step by step, one by one. Again, now that the motor is out, it's hard for me to understand how people could do this on their back or with things underneath the car. So if you're considering doing it yourself, I highly, highly recommend taking the motor out. Here's a question for you. We were talking about how I upgraded to the ceramic bearing initially and now to the IMS Solution. Can you talk about the intervals for each?
Charles, that's a
Yep.
good department for you.
So when we developed the retrofit kit, it was always intended as a preventative maintenance product. So if the original bearing has failed, you can't replace the bearing. There's already foreign object debris that's circulated through the engine, and who knows what other damage it's done. Or if you do manage to put another bearing in there, that damage can then that metal can get into the new bearing and damage or have the new bearing fail completely. So it was always designed to be a preventative maintenance item. So we had to come up with some sort of conservative number. And we had done some modeling on a single row bearing, and a bearing engineer we worked with quoted it was a 10% failure rate at 90,000 miles, assuming an average speed of 35 mile per hour. So working our way backwards, we wanted to have that number be as close to zero as possible. So that's where we came up with intervals of 75,000 miles or 6 years for the dual row bearing, or 4-year 50,000 for the single row bearing, knowing that we wanted to replace it before it started to wear and create debris that could hurt the engine.
Right, and that's a great segue to what I want to talk about. Why am I even doing this? My car was running fine. I was autocrossing 2 weeks ago. The car was running like a champ. However, I wouldn't say I'm religious about it, but I try to be religious about maintaining my car. And I knew I had probably gone over the limitation or the time limit of the bearing. So then I started thinking about the other things on the car. We're talking about the rubber hoses. We're talking about the AOS. And then I know, I had a friend, I don't know if Gregory Brown is watching, but if he is, I remember at one point we took off his oil filter and he had all these little like brittle pieces of plastic that looked like gravel. I'm like, what is that? And I later learned that it was a chain ramps. And so here are the original chain ramps for my car after 98,000 miles. And I'll let Jake talk about what happened here.
Yeah, so there's a lot of unit pressure on these during operation because they are responsible for constantly moving the geometry of the valve train to change the angle of the intake valve through the camshaft manipulation. So as that's happening constantly as you drive, then this unit pressure constantly changes and it goes up and down. And obviously, like I told Vu, you've been driving the car the right way. You've been changing the oil at the right intervals. You've been using good oil because these did last 98,000 miles. So yours are worn, and they are worn to the point that you had almost 10 degrees of cam deviation. The factory allowable on that is only 6 degrees. So you were well outside the range, but you were not far enough outside the range to set a check engine light yet.
It seemed
So
like it was driving fine.
you were within 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees of that. But as we talked about, because this material gets softer, the deeper the wear gets, you're going to progress to that point higher now.
Yeah,
So
and if you can show how porous the material is as you get deeper into the ramps, it's going to degrade quicker.
that's right. It's softer and it's got more porosity in it the deeper that you go. So the rate of progression will advance and escalate as you get more miles on it a lot quicker. So it might take you, 50,000 to get it to that first little layer, but after that it's going to go pretty quick. So yours, I've seen them at 50,000 break completely in half. We've seen that to the point that you were driving the chain directly against the steel portion of that hydraulic adjuster, even at 50,000. Those were usually cars that had long oil service intervals. They sat for years with oil in them. The oil built up acids, all sorts of things, or the car was driven really lightly. And driving it super lightly, and the cams are constantly changing off and on, that seems to really put a lot more load on this. I had plotted that at one time doing data acquisition where I could watch what was going into this solenoid here. And I was able to see that the voltage change was a lot more if I drove the car lightly versus driving it hard.
So we have a full series that's coming, and we don't want to give away all of that. But can you highlight, Charles, some of the special tools that a DIYer, all the tools I have that you can see here, any typical DIYer should have. I don't have that many specialty tools other than maybe a special hose clamp tool, special size sockets, but it's all pretty much straight up stuff that most garage people, again, DIYers garage will have. Would you mind talking about some of the things that you won't have and where you can get those tools?
So the main tools for doing an IMS job would be all the IMS bearing tools, and while you're in there, the rear main seal installation tool. With our IMS program, if you buy the IMS bearing from LN, we offer free tool rental. So that makes it real easy. You can save hundreds of dollars and not have to buy those tools to do the job. With your car, we had to do the variocam ramps. And for that, those tools, you need a few extra tools that's above and beyond a normal. But you probably have other members in your region that probably have done the job before, go on the forums. People are really welcoming to others that want to be do-it-yourselfers and are often willing to share the tools just for the cost of shipping.
Yeah.
So you would need those special tools to do the variocam ramps, which aren't in the tool rental program. But everything else is basically just run-of-the-mill tools. And if you don't have something, before doing the job, we went to Harbor Freight and got a little burr tool to notch the bell housing. You didn't have one to do that, and it wasn't a whole lot of money.
And of all the tools that we came up with, and of course we've had to refine this and create a total program from this, but the extraction tool was probably the most difficult thing to really make. I went through several different generations of that. Some other commercially available tools were things that we had tried to use to pull the bearing out with, but it always tried to separate the IMS shaft, which is 4 pieces of material that's put together. So when I came up with the idea for the puller that we used, it got rid of that because it put all the load on the shaft and it pulled that bearing out of the counter bore without putting any pressure on anything that would try to separate the shaft, because you actually can have an intermediate shaft failure, not a bearing failure, but a failure of the shaft.
Let's see, I want to say to Cody and the Gray Family 5, you're absolutely correct. We definitely needed torque sockets and triple square sockets and such to do this. Question from Shooter1812, are there any cam chain issues on 3-chain engines versus 5-chain engines?
Well, you and I talked about that on some of the videos that we shot here. So with a 3-chain, you actually have a much more simplified process of valve timing. So there's 2 chains missing. The hydraulic unit's missing because you have a vane cell adjuster on the front of the camshaft. It's greatly simplified. So with those engines, if you have high cam deviations, usually somebody's been in there and they've done some work and they didn't get things where they belonged, or you have an IMS drive chain failing, or you have one of the main timing chains failing, because that's usually what causes deviations in a 3-chain engine.
Speaking of high cam deviations, for those of you that are not familiar with how to get those values, if you have a full access to Porsche Diagnostic stuff, obviously you can find it there. We here have a Durametric setup, and it's like literally plug it in, run the software, go down like 2 different clicks and just go down to cam deviation. Click on it and it tells you exactly what the cam deviation is.
Durametric is a powerful tool for that. It's easy to use, and like you said, you can plot it. You can see it while you drive if you want to. You can just check it while you're sitting there idling. The deviation is going to stay the same because it's referencing the crankshaft position sensor and the Hall effect sensors on each cylinder head. So it works really well. In the beginning, when you're like, hey, I've got a deviation, you thought the deviation was between your cams.
Right.
And I'm like, well, what you're looking at on the Durametric feed, because of how you've had the boxes selected, you were referencing it from the crankshaft reference sensor.
Yeah, so with that, you can find out and plan your strategy for what you're doing. It's quite easy, and making that decision. And as we started taking things apart, again, there's lots of references out there. You even have a full series that people can buy and watch and go step by step. But for me, having both of your knowledge here, kind of watching me over my shoulder, those of you that are going to do this at home, find someone that has done it before, that's willing to guide you through it. That is a great way to make sure that the little things, and this is where I've always had an appreciation for mechanics, but that level of appreciation has tripled, if not more. It's just because there's so many steps to do this, and there's so many opportunities to do it wrong. So just go one by one, make sure you have the proper instructions, follow the people that are doing it right, and take your time with it. Don't rush it.
And I think that you have a newfound appreciation for this, and now you see why a shop has to charge, adequate time to do this.
Yeah.
And when you start doing some of the other things on top of this engine and routing things under the intake manifold, then you will really see why we encourage you to pull the engine out of the car to do these other items.
Let's take a question here we have from Jason Pennell. Fresh rebuild, Ellen Nicky's, Jake Video, 997 oil bypass, 2-quart deep sump, filter, adapter, engine runs great. The only thing I've noticed that after oil is really hot, PSI at idle drops to 9 PSI. Is that okay?
So we have to determine how hot is hot.
Okay.
And then it will help us to understand if that is more okay or not. Obviously, it's like, pouring syrup on your pancakes. It comes out really thick because it's cold. When it hits the pancakes, it gets hot and it gets real thin. So the hotter it is, the more it's going to drop. So, the question is, to me, do you have an oil pressure issue or do you have an oil temperature issue that's driving the pressure issue?
Yeah.
Or did he change his oil pressure sending unit?
Right.
Okay.
There's one right behind you.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's another thing that can be in the equation as well. So, the pressure relief valve, there's actually a 997 upgrade for that if he's doing it to a 996. We always change the pressure relief valve to the 997 as well as the spring for that. Even in a 996 or a Boxster engine, that is an upgrade, and that will help with that hot idle oil pressure quite a bit.
So some of the upgrades that I'm doing, or not really upgrades, but just replacements, maintenance. This piece here is the air oil separator. I'm going with the genuine Porsche product going back onto my car. We have a question from MW, an M96 that sees autocross and some track time. What AOS system do you recommend? And I'm assuming they are referring to should they quote unquote upgrade to a motorsports version.
Well, there's some options that you can choose. So the first thing that we have to say is this is the easiest, quickest thing to do. If you buy the genuine unit, then it bolts on and it works as well as the factory intended. Can it fail again? Absolutely. But at the end of the day, if you do something like the motorsports AOS, then Charles and I, and we were all talking about this earlier, it never really fits well on any of these engines. It's almost, there's always modifications. Damon was talking about what he went through when he did his engine. Sometimes you have to splice hoses together. There's no bolt-on for that. There's always deviations to it. So the installation is not straightforward. A lot of times, and I've even seen those dual-chamber motorsports AOSs fail. Sometimes people, I think, will choose it because it says motorsports. They don't understand. They just know, hey, it's motorsports, it's racing, it's good. And they don't know what they don't know when it comes to installing it. There's also one out there called the Ultimate AOS. A friend of ours came out with it. And what is unique about it, it actually uses kind of a gutted AOS unit as a body, but it relocates the diaphragms externally to the front of the engine here where you can get to it in case the diaphragm fails. So one of my customers was operating his 4.4 liter R44 engine in -19 weather earlier this year, and he had the Ultimate AOS. His diaphragm failed because the air was so heavy on such a large engine on a cold start, and he was able to replace that diaphragm for like $18 in 15 minutes because it was so easy to get to. So that's another thing that you could think about doing. Obviously, that's more money. The motorsports is more money. This is the cheapest, easiest thing to do, but I will tell people, if you use one of the stock units, then you must really go genuine. The aftermarket ones of these that we've seen, sometimes they're worse than a used one that has failed.
Okay.
We've seen those go on and be bad out of the box. Now, I'll also say that we've seen the genuine ones go on and be bad out of the box as well. That's a very rare thing. But I've actually installed one, and then it was bad out of the box. So I've had to come up with some protocols and ways to test this thing before we install them.
Yeah, but for me, genuine is the way to go. Again, my car was running great. I'm changing this out as a preventative, but yet when we pulled out, we were working on the putting on the new coolant not coolant, the oil fill tube, and we pulled off the throttle body, we noticed that there was some oil at the top there.
Yeah, your AOS was starting to get tired, and it had been replaced. There'll be a date code on there. I could tell that with the clamps and this and that's not the absolute genuine unit that came on this engine. It was probably changed before you bought the car.
Right,
maybe.
So this would have been pre-2005. I haven't changed it.
Somebody probably changed it just before that, if I had to guess.
Yeah, so these do, and when it fails, like how would I have known other than a check engine light? Like it didn't get.
Well, that's
I
the
didn't know
thing.
that was failing.
It doesn't give a check engine light. So I tell people all the time, if you're depending upon the check engine light to tell you if you have a problem with one of these cars, you're waiting on the wrong thing. It's pretty much monitoring emissions control units. That's the main thing that it's looking for. That's the whole purpose of OBD2. So we've had customers come in with completely failed engines with a connecting rod hanging out of them, and they never had a check engine light, and they only had one stored code for a misfire from that cylinder. So it's one of those things, if you wait till you have a problem, it's too late a lot of times. With this, the symptoms that you're usually going to find, smoke at startup. It can be on a cold engine or an engine that's warmed up as well. It'll be from both tailpipes usually. The other thing that you'll sometimes have, and this is more of a rare case, but you'll have a squealing sound. And people will think the belt's squealing or whatever, but it only happens at idle. As soon as you crack the throttle, then it goes away. So what's happening is one of the diaphragms is failing in such a manner that it's putting excess crankcase vacuum or from the intake manifold in the crankcase, and it's basically, this AOS is not metering that properly anymore. So instead of you pulling 5 to 6 inches of water column of vacuum here, well, maybe you're pulling 18 to 24 inches that the intake's creating because it's bypassing that. So what people don't really understand is you are literally connecting the intake manifold to the sump, the oil sump. The only thing in between those is some hoses and a couple of diaphragms. So when the diaphragm fails, the crankcase vacuum goes up.
Siphons it all the way up.
And it can actually siphon the oil out of the engine into the intake. So you're taking oil out of the sump, bringing it through this failed part, up through some tubes, injecting that. Exactly. So that can cause an issue where you have a situation that bends a connecting rod even.
Oh.
So, but those cases where they will squeal and make that high-pitched noise, that's usually because it's pulling air by the front or rear main seal. And as soon as you go above idle, then it stops. So with those cases, try to remove the oil-filled tube, if you can, then usually that's not the problem. If you can't, it's got so much vacuum on it, it's keeping it from happening.
All right. Another question we have from a member here, 20-plus-year-old motor. Here's what I'm faced with is now that the motor's out, you kind of go, how much of this or how many items should I replace? There's lots of rubber hoses. There's a lot of ancillary items. I've got the AOS. I mentioned earlier that I'm doing the oil fill tube. And believe it or not, out of all the things that we did for the past almost 3 days, which included an IMS Solution install, cam time deviations, do you know what the hardest part of all of this was? Changing the oil-filled tube, and not the tube itself, but at the end of the tube, there's 2 bolts. One bolt is super easy to get to, and then there's one bolt that is buried in the center of the motor, and that was the most frustrating bolt. So if I can do that, the rest of it was really not too bad at all. But are there certain things that you would say, if your engine is out, you definitely should do these things?
Well, where do you stop, right? I mean, that's the thing. Do you just go ahead and take the whole thing apart? And if you do that, when do you stop, right? So I think changing these corrugated tubes that lead to the AOS and lead from here over to the cylinder head, these corrugated tubes are known to crack. They're a real bear to change in the car. Definitely do those. They snake under the intake manifold. Look for pattern issues. Look for, like you said, there's oil around this part. That means it's been leaking. So, obviously we need to check into that. For sure, AOS. If the engine's out of the car, it's a dream to do. It's a minute's worth of job. If it's not, then you're pulling intake manifold pieces, you're snaking up underneath here. It's a real bear, especially if you have the gearbox still in the car. So, it's not uncommon for somebody to pay $800 to $1,000 to change an air oil separator. And people look at it, well, it's a $100 part or whatever. Well, look at the labor. you see.
Yeah, the
So-
position of this and where it's going to be in the car. Oh man,
And for time versus cost,
Yeah.
oil fill tube,
Yeah.
for how long it took, that was probably the most expensive. That would have been
Yeah.
the most labor per dollar apart doing the oil fill tube. So, yeah, it's
And like we were talking, everything's out. You can get to the starter easy. Well, do you change the starter, but yours had no symptom? Or do you maybe take a risk on putting one in there that's lower quality than what you've got now, even though it's 25 years old?
Right.
So there's always decisions to be made. And that's where, as a professional, we've learned what not to do. That's the key. And, we've got, 45 certified installers for the IMS solution, and they've all come to my classes. So they're all over the country. So we keep them up to date. Those guys have got the most amount of information. We've actually got a training session with them on May 8th again to recertify everybody and bring them all back up to speed with what we may have learned in the last couple of years. So they kind of know more about these than most other shops do because we've got a network. We've got groups, and we keep them informed.
Yeah, I want to add something else. So, like for fuel system, yeah, if you have a Durametric, you can look at fuel trim values. If they all look good, probably the injectors are good. If you have access to a smoke tester, before you start breaking into the engine, you put a smoke tester on it. It pressurizes the intake manifold with a low pressure with smoke, and if there's any cracks anywhere, it'll seep out. You'll see it. There's little things you could do, but like Jake was talking about, the quality, the actual rubber, like the coolant hoses in the car, they're excellent. Unless you've had an oil leak and the rubber hose has been exposed to petroleum product for an extended period, either inside or outside, and the hose gets gummy, then you need to replace it. And as we were talking about, if there was intermix.
right.
The worst thing, if a car sits with intermix for an extended period of time, it destroys.
Explain intermix.
So intermix, so if you have an engine where it cracks a cylinder or cracks a cylinder head and you get coolant mixed with the engine oil, that circulates to the cooling system, and every piece of rubber inside the engine is exposed to petroleum product, which is not supposed to see, and the hoses will get gummy. And if they sit, then you have to replace every hose in the car. And that gets very expensive, very fast, both cost of the parts and the labor. The labor is probably the worst because you even have to change the hoses on the heater core.
Okay. Let's take a question from family in a Porsche. Let's see. Family in a Porsche. Rest of the car is essentially stock, including factory DME. The problem is it doesn't seem to be quote unquote breathing correctly. Initial hesitation upon throttle and instrument panel lights above 5,200 RPM.
Okay, so the key that I'm hearing there is above 5,200 RPM because that is a point where a lot of things are changing. Horsepower and torque cross right there, and that's also the point where this hydraulic
ramp?
chain adjuster actually goes back the other direction. So it moves one way at 2,200 RPM, it stays there up to 5,200 RPM. Throttle does play with that a little bit, but after 5,200, if you're seeing things like that, then maybe you've got something going on with your cam deviations, and that's create an issue. Of course, when I hear that hesitation and I hear those kind of symptoms, and I know we're having a lot of fuel pump issues with these cars because they're old, ethanol fuel's taking their toll. There's not a lot of fuel pumps out there in the system. A lot have been bought up. So I would say I would definitely look for something in the fuel delivery side of things.
Okay.
Also, mass airflow sensor, possibly that's been fouled. O2 sensor should be reporting erroneous information and it's trying to run lean. There's a lot of things. If this person has a Durametric, they could really learn a lot with it.
One of the things that you brought up this scenario, which I didn't tell you about. I was simply inquiring about whether or not there's a sensor that goes right here. And I noticed that we had a replacement one, and you said, oh yeah, we should replace it. It's easy to get to, and because when they go bad, this, and this happens, and you literally explained what happens to my car when I come to a stop sign on a very hot day.
Well, and that just comes from exposure and experience working with these engines for so long, and most anybody that works on these cars see these pattern failures, and we know what they are, but that crank position sensor going through that failure mode, the hotter the engine gets, the more it's going to act up. You'll see your tach kind of bounce around. Ultimately, it'll leave you on the side of the road. I've been left on the side of the road by a 996 that had a crankshaft position sensor failure, and as soon as it died, I tried to turn the engine over, tack's not moving, I knew exactly what it was. So that sensor, if anybody's going on a road trip, definitely change it. And definitely also keep your old one in the car too.
As a backup.
As a backup, because you can get a bad new part. It happens very infrequently, but it certainly can happen. And it's only one 5mm bolt, and I have crawled underneath a hot car and changed it. It's not fun, but you can do it on the side of the road if you have that tool and a sensor.
In fact, you said keep the sensor in the glove box and a 5mm wrench and socket so that you could get to it.
Yeah, when I was going to drive my 996 up here, I had that in
Ready
my
to go?
spare. Exactly, yes.
All right, here's an interesting one. I've never had this question for. Miami Vibes. Hello, can you safely add no more than 50 shot of nitrous to your built M97 4.0 track package? Will the upgraded internals handle the additional pressure? I don't get nitrous questions very often here in PCA. That's
Well,
a first. Thank you for that question.
The thing I would say is he needs to try it and let us know how it works out.
But here it is, though. An M97 4-liter track package, that in itself should be more than enough for most drivers.
Well, I mean, that engine, when I build it, is 400 horsepower in the neighborhood according to what exhaust and intake you're going with and things like that. 400 is a normal number for an engine like that I built in the last 3 or 4 years. People always want more, obviously. And we've played with some nitrous with these things, but usually you're having to upgrade a lot more to it. I've got one intake manifold I've modified for nozzles and that sort of thing. Yeah, obviously it should take it, but nitrous does really weird things, you know. And with one of these, like a wet shot where you're going to be bringing in more fuel with it, that's a lot safer because you can meter that fuel instead of a dry shot where you're dependent upon ramping up the ECU, ramping up the injectors. So yeah, I mean, why not try it, see what happens.
Speaking of upgrades, you kind of had to keep me at bay because I would, if I'm taking things apart and putting things on, I too think of what performance stuff can I put on. With the AOS, I decided I want genuine Porsche. With the clutch and flywheel, you made a recommendation for me pretty much to stay away from any kind of quote-unquote upgrade.
Well, and the reason for that is I put 400 horsepower through this all the time. So with a stock pressure plate, stock flywheel, that is a new flywheel. Damon, you can see I've got some balance marks here. When Vu ordered this, we were able to put it on my dynamic balancer. And Damon, you might be able to show the holes that we drilled, how far out of balance it actually was. So, was it balanced okay from the factory? Yes. If your tolerance of acceptance is wide enough, anything's balanced. But I wanted to make it better, so I took it to 0.2 of 1 ounce per inch for a tolerance, and that's really tight. I think you'll notice a difference. The main reason I did this is because some of these newer parts are elliptical. They don't run true. So I wanted to put it in my balancer and spin it up so I could make sure that everything ran true. Because if it's not true, you can't balance it. Any kind of run out's a problem. So, I try to stay away from a lot of the aftermarket clutches until I start making about 450 at the crankshaft. I don't really start changing this stuff. And I've modified some of the factory ones and we've shimmed them and done things so you get more out of a stock one. Because as soon as you start going to a heavier one, in traffic, your leg's going to get killed. Like a stage 2 or a stage 3, a big trade-off. And I'll have to say, one of the drawbacks of like my 4.3 and 4.4 engines is that, because people get really sick of that clutch real quick. So, but with your car, it's mostly virgin as far as all the stuff done to it, and you want to kind of keep your eyes on the prize. You don't want to go too crazy. You start going crazy with an engine that has almost 100,000 miles on it, and you can start to degrade things kind of quickly.
Yeah, and I feel like if you're going to start doing one end or one part of it, you kind of have to think of it holistically, that if you want to get to a 4-liter, like that should just go 4-liter, as opposed to just adding here, and thinking it's additive. So many people, Charles, right? They say, can I get this part, and add it together?
The whole idea of doing this is so that you could go another 5-6 years and do brake pads, wiper blades, oil change, fuel, and just not have to worry about any of these pattern failure items.
Right.
And just drive the car. And you looked up, you reminded me, you've already done the expansion tank. Means that's another item. The car's already over 20 years old. Plastic components degrade.
Right.
With the heat, it's hot in there. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and I mean, to me, if you want performance, you need to go all the way. People that try to sneak up on it a lot of times, well, that doesn't work out too well with these engines. Other cars, it works out okay. But generally with these, if you start putting superchargers on them and things like that, they're catalysts for other issues to occur. If you build the engine up and it's built for it and it's tuned for it, that's a different story. But if you're asking a 99,000 mile engine to continue performing at a higher level than it's been performing at for 99,000 or 98,000 miles, well, you never know what's going to happen.
Speaking of mileage, we have a question from Darius Zolk. What's the highest mile engine you've worked on? 996, 997.
Well, unfortunately, we don't see a lot of high mileage ones. 282,000 is the most I've personally seen.
282, that sounds pretty high to me.
But that was only like one. So another one was in the 260 range. Most of these engines that I see, at least in the older days, would have failed or had a problem from 40 to about 80,000 miles.
Yeah.
And usually that was an IMS bearing failure or bore scoring. Today, we're seeing some of them, most of them now are 80 to 120,000. Rarely do we see anything 150 or more. So, the cars were driven a lot when they were newer. Today, it's mostly weekend drivers. So it's taking them a lot longer to rack up miles than it used to.
That's true. Yeah, the first year I had this, I put on 30,000 miles, and that was to get me to 80. And from that, after that first year, so that would be 2007 till now, I only got to 98, right? So.
And there's a fellow that has an X51 version of this M9603 engine that he recently messaged me. He had almost 500,000 on it.
Wow.
And it's kind of a well-known car, and it cracked the head finally. But it's the head crack that can't be repaired.
Is that the D chunk?
It's the one inside the secondary air ports. It's so deep in the head, and I've actually never seen that happen to an X51 head. I've seen it happen to the M9603 normal heads, but that took that one off the road. And he wanted to keep going with it. He's like, I just want to find a head and put it on there because I want to see how far it'll go.
Right. Oh, pretty cool. Can you explain, we have a question here, could you discuss the advantage of the spin-on filter adapter? Now, so I already had the spin-on filter that takes a 1042 Napa Gold filter. The IMS Solution has a different spin-on filter, and it takes filtered oil from that spin-on filter adapter and brings it to the IMS Solution there. So can you share a little bit of knowledge there?
So the spin-on filter adapter was originally invented as part of the IMS Solution, but we knew it was going to take us years to bring the solution to market because we had a lot of development to do. So we had a different version of it that did not use this oil hose, and that's what most people have. That uses the 1042. That's what you had before. So the benefit of that is you get rid of the plastic canister. And to me, the other main benefit is you're able to filter 100% of the oil 100% of the time. You don't have any bypass valves or anything like that in the canister. It's also a metal filter, and this filter is used on Corvette engines. It's also used on hydraulic applications. So Charles actually did a whole lot of the development on which filter to use, and we tested probably 50 filters, different brands, different sizes. We made different versions of it because we wanted something that filtered properly, but we also wanted something that also had a great flow value because you can filter oil to the point where you don't have any oil pressure anymore. And that's a big problem. So you've got to have that trade-off of filtration versus pressure and volume. And that's what we did. So it's a highly track-proven product. I think that was something that we brought to market in 2008 or 2007.
It was a long time ago.
And it was a predecessor, obviously, of what you see here for the IMS Solution. The spin-on filter adapter for the IMS Solution is special. You should show the fitting there. But it also is special because it uses a different filter, like the 1348 or the 1215, because we had to incorporate that into the function of the IMS Solution. So when the engine started up, it had instant oil pressure to that plain bearing.
We have another question here. Is it normal for oil pressure to fluctuate at idle?
Well, again, how hot is it, right? To me, if I see fluctuations, I usually start going to that oil pressure sending unit. Anybody out there that has an oil pressure sending unit that makes the gauge kind of nervous. I was telling you about that. So once the engine's up at temperature, if it's maybe been run for 20 or 30 minutes, especially in hot weather, the resistance in the sensor starts to change, and it will usually make your temperature, your pressure gauge bounce a little bit, especially if you hold it at 1 RPM. If it's between like 3 and 4 and it just has a nervous twitch, that usually tells me that the sending unit is questionable or is going bad. They can also fail where they say you have 5 bar all the time. They can also fail where they say you have no pressure. So there's a lot of different ways. To me, if you haven't changed that oil pressure sending unit and you have one of these engines, buy one tomorrow.
Yeah, and that's definitely a DIY project. It's on the passenger side. You can open and find it on the side there. You can use an open-ended wrench to just spin it off. There's 2 electrical connections. It is very important. Do not pull by the wire. Pull by the connection point and just pull those up. It spins off with, as I said, an open-ended wrench. Carefully start the threads with your hand before you put a wrench on it to put the new one on. That's a super easy DIY.
Yep, 19 millimeter wrench and you're in business on that one.
And you should do if you're going to do that, you might as well do the 997 upgraded pressure relief and spring at the same time, because that's like $20-something in parts to do that, and you can easily access that from underneath the car.
All right. Again, without giving away our series, is there any other precautions that you might want to share with our viewers on, or other things that they might want to consider replacing while the engine's out?
Well, precautions, I think the main thing is that you find the right shop to do this work if you're not going to do it yourself. You know, price shopping is a big problem because this job, unfortunately, in a lot of ways has become like a brake job to shops. And a lot of them are racing to try to do the job as quick as they can, and that's the last thing you want to do. Because like I was telling you, you know, a 2-minute job is just 20 seconds away from being a 2-day job, right?
Right, that one bolt.
Exactly, breaking bolts or whatever. So precaution, you know, do your homework on that. And don't just do it by how many of these jobs somebody's done. You know, a guy that's done this job 500 times, like at my shop, we did it 760 times before we stopped doing it just to focus on building engines. But I was constantly like telling my guys, hey, we can't get complacent with this. You're still spending the right amount of time on it. So if somebody's done it 200 times, maybe they're going to try to rush through it because they think they're doing a brake job. So sometimes a shop that hasn't done as many, but they got the right training and they have the right tools, is the better shop to do it. As far as other things to do, I mean, obviously they need to watch our series because we hit all those high points. Between the experience Charles and I have, we were pretty much able to hit the nail on the head with what you needed to do. But when we got here, we also found some other things that we didn't plan for.
Right, absolutely. So you'll be going to the hardware store, or you'll be going to the auto parts store, or you'll be calling your favorite parts supplier. Don't plan to knock this out easily in a weekend. At least for a DIYer, you want to make sure you make a list. If you call Charles or your favorite supplier, they know what you're trying to attempt, they can give you a fulsome list, because Charles ordered things for me that I didn't even think about, and we still were missing things. Can you talk a little bit about my engine? This is a February 1998 motor, and this is a cable throttle motor. There's motors that are e-gas, and then there's 3.4, 3.6s. What are the various differences between them?
Well, yours is unique in the fact that it's a 99 C2, and it does have the throttle cable, which is hanging over your head right here.
Right here, yep.
So the C4 in 99 actually had drive-by-wire. So the C2 is the only car that had a cable-driven throttle body. So that's good. A lot of people like the throttle modulation. It makes it feel like a more analog car because it is. Also, at the same time, it kind of really limits what you can do with intake mods because there's no real good way to go to a bigger throttle body and things like that. Even though we do bore them oversized and stuff, you can't go as big as you could if you had a 2000 or newer that was drive-by-wire. Then you can bolt on a GT3 throttle body and make a 4-liter Scream, right? So that kind of is a pro and con with that. Also, idle air regulators are hard to come by these days. That's the part that makes the engine idle, which could have also been affecting your situation. Because there's not a lot of parts out there made for that. But definitely, from a performance perspective, you're kind of the underdog with that. But from an analog experience, you got the best car.
So speaking of best cars, when I bought this in 2005, at the time I could have bought a much higher mileage out of warranty 993, but I chose, because I wanted, this was going to be my daily driver. I could get a car with 50,000 miles with a factory warranty. I caught some flack, to be honest with you, by owning a early 996. How has that changed to today with people wanting to be in a 996?
Well, what we've learned is what the car has taught us is these are the best built cars, the early ones are. Like, obviously your car is so early, it was probably on the assembly line with some of the last 993s like we talked about. So to me, I want the earliest car I can find. And just because I like the analog, I like the simplicity, the cars to me drive different. And I'm not the only person that said that. Now keep in mind, some years I would drive over 100 cars because we had them shipped from all over the country and we had to go put at least 50 to 100 miles on them. So I was able to say, hey, this 99, it does drive completely different than the other cars do. To me, in 2005, 08, in that time period, the 99 was like the ugly duckling. Nobody wanted it. Oh, why do you want a 99, right?
Right.
But they also made a lot of them in 99. As far as production numbers, like it seemed like almost every car you saw for sale for a long time was a 99. So the prices were lower for those. Today, the tide's turned, and people are seeking out 99s. And, I'm one of those people.
Now, did you see, because they made so many 99s early on and people, they were extremely reliable, especially with the air conditioning. It was a modern car, so many people were using them as daily drivers and also not maintaining them because it was their daily driver. So a lot of 99s also met like an untimely death.
That and a lot of them were lease cars. A severe amount of the engines we saw fail, if we went back and looked at Carfax on those cars, it was originally a corporate car, a lease car, and nobody took care of it.
Yep. So let's see, oh my gosh, we're already almost at the top of the hour. Anything else from you, Charles, in terms of recommendations for DIYers? Anything else about IMS bearings that you want to share?
My biggest thing, I see a lot of people when they send their registrations in, they have to submit a copy of the work order of what was done. And I see a lot of shops put blinders on, like I already mentioned, and some shops don't even drain the oil or change the oil. They're not even replacing the clutch or the flywheel or even the rear main seal. Literally, they're just going in, doing an IMS bearing, and just ignoring everything else in the car to make the job as cheap as possible. And you're doing yourself no favor with all that labor that goes in.
Right.
And there's a lot of instances, because we have shops and even do-it-yourselfers that they'll have a 5-chain motor like you, and they're like, do I really need to do the VarioCam wear ramps? I don't have it in my budget right now.
Yeah.
I'm like, well, you're already at 14 degrees and you got a check engine light. If you keep driving it and you just do the IMS bearing, you could harm the IMS bearing, or you could have a catastrophic failure. You're best off, if you don't have it in your budget, just don't drive the car right this minute. Hold off on doing the job and do it right one time rather than
piecemealing
it and possibly ends up costing you a whole lot
And
more.
the way I can explain that is, you're getting free labor to do some of this if you understand how it's done.
If you're doing a clutch already.
If you're doing, you've got to remove this to gain access to the IMS. So you're paying basically for the parts and maybe a little bit on labor. But if you maybe a year or two later down the road have to do the clutch, you're paying basically the same amount of labor all over again.
Right. And more than likely, they're going to say, since we're doing it, you might as well replace the clutch and flywheel again. And you've maybe used a half or a quarter of the life of the assembly.
And one thing I would like to bring up too is these flywheels are one-time use only. They're not to be resurfaced. Luke, the company that makes them, every company that makes a dual mass flywheel, they say, hey, you're not supposed to resurface these things. And we've seen people do it and they have clutch chatter and all sorts of weird things. But this being a dual mass flywheel, it actually has another failure mode where the second mass can fail. It bounces around. It causes all kinds of misfire issues and stuff. So that's the reason why we made the decision to change yours out, and yours was dead. So it's a good thing we did that.
Right.
But today, every engine I build, they all get a brand new flywheel and clutch.
All right, folks. Well, we had a little bit of an hour to chat about the IMS bearing, while you're in their upgrades. Like I said, we have an upcoming 996 video series that's going to be talking about all the things that we have done over the past 3 days. I know you all love it, so make sure you subscribe. So as we release them, YouTube will let you know when the video is released. So again, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. A couple of reminders housekeeping wise. Parade. We are going to Birmingham June 9th through 15th. We're also going to Alaska with Treffin at Sea July 28th through August 4th. If you're interested in doing some sim racing with other PCA members, you can't get out to the track, but you have a sim racing rig at home, check out PCASimRacing.com. We actually have a sim rig, sort of a starter sim rig that we put together with the company. So if you're interested in a plug and play system, we have a system that we can recommend. And if you haven't checked us out on the PCA podcast, Porsche Club Insider, we're at episode 112. We'd love to share that with you. We share it with you every week. Drops on Mondays. Lots of fun there. And finally, if you own a Porsche and you haven't joined PCA, what are you waiting for? Become a PCA member. We're just head over to PCA.org and we'll get you signed up. We also have newsletters. I don't know if Robert can bring up the newsletters, but we have e-brake news, Mark Fresh news, performance news, staying up to date on what's going on with Porsche, with PCA. And ladies and gentlemen, that's an hour of talking about the IMS bearing. I want to thank Charles, Jake, not only for Tech Tactics Live, but also watching over my shoulder as I attempted by far the most complicated car project I've ever done. And like I said, the funniest part, the one that I was sweating and got most aggravated, was the one bolt for the oil fill tube. Everything else has been smooth, and thank you to the both of you for making that happen.
You're welcome.
Till next time, take care.